Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. Karl, Schroeder, and Peter Watts are here today, and Marty just kind of lets them go at it, and they're old buddies, so it's all good. Everyone's still friends at the end of it. And though they talk about many things, the main subject matter seems to be the value of optimism or pessimism. Next week is the first Trivia from the Bridge episode, and Shauna McGuire and Corey Doctorow are on that episode. All right, Karl and Peter are waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Hi, Peter and Karl, welcome back on the show. This is our first conversation between returning authors to the show. These are now officially friends of the show, having been on Tales from the Bridge at least once before. Karl Schroeder has also joined us at Fan Expo twice to give a talk on colonizing Venus once and on micro habitats in space this year in Toronto. And Peter Watts joined us 2 years ago, and he gave a talk that scared everybody out of the room, as is his want and his talent. And he told us why it's all really quite hopeless. Well, mostly you scared the children and parents out of the room with the first video clip. So welcome back on the show, guys. It's really great to have you here. What we were hoping to do tonight is just have a conversation between you, because we know that you're both friends. You both live in Toronto. You're both Canadian science fiction authors. You've known each other for ages, I think. I don't know how long. How long have you known each other?
25 years?
Whoa! It was 1998, I think, we met.
Something like that.
We actually shared a girlfriend for a while, unknowingly to me, I might add.
Oh.
Yes, it was complicated. But
well, that's great, and probably best left in the deep, dark past.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing we still get along.
But we knew each other by reputation before that as well, going back to the
How could you have known me by reputation? I had like one story out.
Well, maybe it was other stuff you were getting up to. I don't know, but certainly knew about you. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah. So, and what we know from having interacted with you and interviewed you before is that both your science fiction writing and your, I think, take on various topics and issues and ideas tends to be fairly different from each other. So we thought it'd be really interesting to basically have you guys fight it out. This is a cage match. We're hoping it gets bloody. No, I'm just kidding. We would love to just hear, your two very differing opinions, probably on a few topics. If you agree, that's okay. I think it'll be interesting conversation to have anyway.
Peter and I disagree on almost everything and yet come to almost identical conclusions when we're writing.
It's true.
Yeah.
The main conclusion being that, extinction is not only inevitable, but desirable. Oh. You haven't changed your position on that, have you, Karl?
Well, as long as you put it a few million years down the road, sure.
Oh, well, that's great. Where do you put that, Peter? When would you prefer us to go to extinct?
Well, MIT says major or global societal collapse starts around 2040. That was before Ukraine. So I'm going to push that ahead to about 2030, given that most of our worst case scenarios tend to be too optimistic when you actually look back at them. That's just the collapse of major global infrastructure, though. That's not species extinction by any means. I think as a test species, we're probably too ornery to die off as a species. But if you're the kind of person that likes VR or playing Xbox, you should probably get as much of that in the next few years as you possibly can.
Well, the thing about projections like that is that they're right as far as they go, in that absolutely this particular civilization cannot continue staggering forward into the future in its current zombie-like state. But the collapse of what we have now doesn't necessarily mean the collapse of everything, or to put it another way, something else could be given birth to in the next 20 years that's better.
Are you talking about kind of an empire of the ants thing, or are you thinking that we ourselves will see the evil of our ways and become Cub Scoutmasters.
Now, I've never been a big fan of, great spiritual awakenings kind of visions of the future where, the whole species collectively decides, oh, wait a minute, that was a bad idea, and starts doing something else. No, I think that it's more along the lines of thousands of different systems changes at all sorts of different levels that just change the way we do economics and change the way we do society without anybody steering and necessarily anybody knowing what's going on. And it's not necessarily positive, but it's not the same thing as a collapse. We've been pretty adroit at avoiding sort of the obvious ways in which we could collapse. And I think we're going to continue to be that way. But
have we, though? I mean, like 5 years ago, the Arctic permafrost in the Canadian North had thawed to a depth that wasn't predicted to happen until 2070. I don't have to tell you guys that like literally a third of Pakistan is underwater. I'm not seeing us avoiding anything unless you're talking about Elon Musk and his ilk. They'll probably get away with it. But the world at large doesn't seem to be adroitly avoiding anything other than apocalypse at this point.
Well, it depends on what you look at. In terms of, for instance, energy transition, the price of batteries has gone down by 97% in the last 10 years. Solar power has undergone similar transformation. So renewables are now the most inexpensive form of energy production everywhere in the world. So there are tipping points, natural tipping points like the ones we face in the Arctic, but there are also economic and social tipping points that we're approaching from the other direction in terms of, for instance, potentially a mass exodus off of fossil fuels just because they're too expensive suddenly. And that suddenly, of course, being the result of decades of work by thousands and even millions of people. There's tipping points in either direction, potentially. And that's what, I tend to think of this as a liminal moment. And what I tend to feel that I write lately is what I call pre-apocalyptic fiction. Fiction where it could go either way, to sort of reflect the situation that we're in.
I mean, I don't want to harp on climate change. It's kind of the flavor of the month, and we don't want to, give short shrift to things like just habitat destruction or nanotech gray goose scenarios or anything. But climate change, the effects of climate change are front and center these days. And the problem, it's very hopeful that renewables have absolutely collapsed in terms of price. The problem is there's a huge backlog that's already in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And we are royally fucked if we can't suck that out. And the orca plants that are, sequestering atmospheric carbon into limestone have to be scaled up by factors of millions before they can even, at least the numbers I did, my back of the napkin numbers, before they could even keep pace with our 2017 emissions. And our 2022 emissions are now higher than they've ever been. We don't even seem to be bending that curve, much less dig into the backlog. Things like tree planting are great, but most of the studies I've seen suggest that you can plant trees until the next millennium, and they still won't keep up with the amount of deforestation that's happening. I mean, thank God Bolsonaro's out of the picture for the time being, but just deforestation as a result of desertification is killing off trees faster than we could conceivably replant them. So again, without wanting to turn this into a climate change dystopia talk, I think that while the ascendance of renewables is an awesome development, and while it would be great if we could go back in time with these batteries and sort of plunk them down in the 1950s and start all over again, that would be awesome. I think at this point, to some extent, the ship has already sailed, because we're talking about planetary thermal systems, and those puppies turn very, very slowly.
It's true. The biggest problem there being the ocean, where the thermal pulse is going to take decades to work through it. On the other hand, I was down in New York working with SpaceX, or not SpaceX, sorry, X Prize. It had an X in it, similar. A couple of months back, talking about, basically save the world kind of level projects. And one of them that it does have traction and does seem to be entirely possible is the one that everyone thinks is impossible, which is the solar sunshade. It does seem that we could return the global temperature to pre-industrial levels within, say, 25 years for less than $100 billion. And the thing about these ideas like that is that they're so ill-studied. So little money and so little time and so little effort has been put into studying them at all, that it's a miracle that there's sort of any information about it at all. But every time someone studies that particular solution, for instance, it looks easier and easier and cheaper and cheaper. Now, that said, of course, it comes with unintended consequences. But we're really rapidly reaching a point where we're dying of a poison and someone's giving us an antidote, and we're pushing it away saying, I'm not taking that. It might have unintended consequences. There are possibilities. And the thing about, of course, the global sunshade is that it does nothing about that pulse of heat going through the ocean. And it does nothing about ocean acidification, and it does nothing about the actual CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a symptomatic treatment. But what it does do is buy time, not for us, but for the other species. And I tend not to be a humanist. I tend to be more allied with life in general on the planet. And if I were an advocate of life in general on the planet, I would be saying, do something like that. It's time.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, as you say, there's not much in the way of hard research that's gone into any of this stuff. I can't speak to whether or not a solar sunshade, or for that matter, stratospheric sulfate injection.
I don't like that one.
Although that's a much more dangerous option.
Yeah.
I don't consider myself competent to pass judgment on the logistics of that. I will say I wish I shared your optimistic view about tech bro society.
Oh, it's not tech bro society. It's
I don't know. The X Prize, I've had a bit of experience with the X Prize people myself. And you, I mean, we're both involved in Mez's, I guess apparently in stasis for the time being, Tapestries project, right? There were some hugely cutting edge projects and people there, and I was appalled at how little they knew about their own field. The guy who invented neural dust was not aware of a 20-year-old patent that suggested that his neural dust technology, if actually deployed into the brain, would cause hallucinatory artifacts in the somatosensory cortex. He hadn't even heard of the patent. Nobody had asked him the question before. The Neuralink people are, putting aside the legal actions going against what they're doing to their research animals, the Neuralink people seem remarkably unaware of cases like the Hogan twins, they don't seem to know how consciousness manifests, and yet they're explicitly trying to connect, as Musk puts it, connect brains to the internet as seamlessly as our limbic system is connected to our neocortex. It's weird. I actually got the co-founder of Neuralink. I basically wrote a story in which, and this is not for Karl, this is for the audience because Karl's already read it. One of the few people who has. I basically wrote a story about all the catastrophic things that are bound to go wrong if Neuralink works the way it's supposed to. And in order to avoid legal action, instead of calling the company Neuralink, I called it Meta. And then Zuckerberg changed the name of Facebook to... Anyhow, I'm taking that as an omen and sticking with it. But it turns out...
Well, you should sue that guy, man. He totally stole your idea and your name as well.
It turns out at the end of the month, I'm talking to the Rotman School of Business for something called the Creative Destruction Labs, where they're actually talking about my story. And it's part of their book club.
Cool. Wow.
And the person that put them onto that was the co-founder of Neuralink. So I don't know whether I'm expecting an interview or an ambush, but I find it kind of weird that a story that in fact I hadn't even finished writing it at the time that I got this invitation from Rotman, has apparently piqued enough interest from the co-founder of Neuralink that it's getting, I don't know, talked about by other tech bros. But I keep running, every now and then I sort of dabble in the sort of the consulting bits and the high tech bits, and there seems to be a faith in technology saving our asses without us actually having to change ourselves at all. A kind of a faith in tech solutions without, as Karl says, without looking at the unforeseen consequences.
True, but there's the flip side of that is that there's a vast number of people who believe that, again, we need to have the great spiritual change, and everyone has to decide and come together without anyone having a clue politically and socially how that's going to be accomplished.
I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't talk about. I would just to set myself apart from those people. I'm not expecting everybody to link their arms and sing Kumbaya. I'm counting on somebody basically the Joker with ethics and a biomedical degree, spiking our drinking supply with something that rewires our brains. Personally, I think that's the only way we're gonna get out of this mess.
Well, one of the questions that I wonder is whether if your worst enemy came to you with the ironclad plan for saving the world, would you get on board? And I'm not asking you directly, but this is a question that actually I think all of us need to sort of think about. The problem with, I think we can get off the climate change shortly, but the problem with climate change is that it's a thermodynamic problem that people think is a political problem. It's a thermodynamic problem, and there are political things that can be done about it. But what we tend to do is we tend to focus on the political stagnation and backstabbing and all of that stuff, and think that because the political dimension of that issue is failing, there is nothing that we can do and nothing that can be done. But it remains, in the end, a thermodynamic and chemical problem. And we do not have a clue what is possible in terms of the interventions that we can do on those levels, partly because we're so focused on the social and political dimensions that, as I said, almost no research goes into, like thousands of dollars, maybe $1 million here and there, goes into actual solutions to the physical problem that we're facing. All the rest of it gets poured into the politics.
I'm
Well, it
pretty
seems to
sure
me
there's
there.
more than a few $1,000s going into carbon sequestration.
Well, now, yeah, but very recently on that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's been this political, maybe psychological problem, right, where the environmental movement has decided that if we present people with a technological solution that would disincentivize the polluters from continuing to spew more CO2. And so let's not talk about that. Let's not actually fund that kind of research, because then,
Which
we
that
won't
was
be able to
yeah.
get people to quit. And that's a weak solution. It's not going to work, and it hasn't worked.
Well, it was a great argument 10 years ago, and I think it was a valid argument. But when renewables became a self-propelling wheel, where they get cheaper and cheaper no matter what the politics and how much money fossil fuel companies throw into them, that argument started to lose its traction.
I mean, the economics, assuming that there's no economic inertia, are sound, I think. The problem is there's already so much infrastructure dedicated and invested in fossil fuel extraction that we've got even Trudeau, who granted is a vacuous bobblehead in an empty suit, was still on he still says generally the right things about how bad climate change is and how we must combat it, but he's still providing billions of dollars, billions I think, a year subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and is still on record as having said just a few years ago only an idiot would find oil in the ground and leave it there.
Right.
And that's exactly what we have to do. The fact that solar and wind and even geothermal are now more economically feasible from an even starting line is actually irrelevant to the fact that the system is already so heavily invested in fossil fuels that the plans of all the plans of the entire petrochemical industry right now are not let's switch to solar. It's let's dig as much oil as we can out of the ground and burn the shit out of that fuckers while, to cover our tracks. And then when there's nothing left, then we move to clean energy. I mean, this is literally what they are doing. There is, in a weird way, a perverse incentive because they see the writing on the wall. They see the renewables becoming more and more affordable. They realize that their investment is losing value. So one of their responses has been to amp up fossil fuel production. Biden approved more of oil drilling leases in his first 6 months in office than Trump did during his entire first term.
I don't
see, and that was all happening while the price of renewables was collapsing. I don't see an upside to this.
Well, sure. I mean, all of that's true. The question is, how long can that continue? Just in terms of strict economics, how long can that continue? And I don't think it can. It is an utterly unsustainable system. What it is,
dude, you're talking about the long term. They don't care whether it's sustainable in the long term. They care about the next quarterly report.
You know what? It's the long term until suddenly everything collapses. This is not the sort of thing where there's a long tapering off of fossil fuels. This is going to be a complete collapse when it happens. And I don't think that's too far off. No. Sorry. I mean, it's amazing, but actually Peter and I disagree.
You could actually argue that the tapering off of the fossil fuel industry has been going on for decades now. Things like the Alberta tar sands would, 10 years before they were economic, they weren't economic. But the fact that we continue to extract, greater amounts of increasingly unprofitable fossil fuels from increasingly suboptimal environments suggests that the tapering has been going on for quite some time. That's why we're having to dig deeper and deeper, to burn 3 barrels of oil in order to get 4 barrels of oil out of the tar sands.
Yeah, well, to circle around to the beginning, this is what is sustaining this unsustainable civilization that is going to collapse. This is the civilization that is going to collapse. It is the petrochemical civilization. And yeah, if it's going to collapse by 2040, 2030, that's exactly what I'm talking about. But the collapse of that civilization does not mean that another one isn't necessarily waiting in the wings.
But, and I agree with you there, but, and this is where we can get away from climate change. My argument is that climate change is not actually even a problem, it is a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
Before we had climate change, we had a nuclear arms race. Now, once again, we have a nuclear arms race. We've got surveillance capitalism. I think that the problem fundamentally comes down to the fact that brains that evolved to deal with local problems with short-term consequences are in charge of technology that now has global long-term impacts. And we can cheat our way out of an arms race. We can cheat our way out of an ozone hole. We can cheat our way, hopefully, possibly. Civilization will collapse and a new civilization will come up, but it is still going to be run by a bunch of self-important chimpanzees who use their big brains to make excuses for their brainstems instead of keeping their brainstems under control. And I think that's the problem ultimately that we have to address, because as long as we continue to think short-term, local about long-term global problems, then we are going to keep creating something that bites us in the ass. And
I couldn't agree more. You and I have approached it from slightly different directions, but I've been saying for like 10 years now that the problem is governance. Governance is the only problem that we need to solve all the others. It's the problem, the meta problem. But long-term thinking isn't impossible for this species. When they built Oxford College, they planted oak trees in the expectation that 200 years later they would harvest the oak trees for new beams to fix the roof of the hall.
The difference there is that nobody said to the guys who were planting the oak trees, yes, 200 years from now, we're going to have these great beams, but it's going to cost you a couple of lattes a week right now for that to happen. There was never that kind of a trade-off. There was never you're going to have to give up your third TV if you want to balance the budget. Hyperbolic discounting pretty much guarantees that if we are offered something that's going to pay off in 200 years, but it's going to cost us now, we'll say, fuck that. And we will choose Armageddon in 10 years rather than mild inconvenience tomorrow, because the future just isn't real to us. It isn't as real to us as the present. That's just the way our brains evolved.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
But we have processes that we add to our brains. The major and most important ones are something we call institutions. Institutions are the specific invention that we have to make up for that Ice Age neurology. And the current set that we have were designed in an earlier day for different purposes by different people. To work with different technologies. But that does not mean that we cannot reinvent or invent new institutions that are appropriate to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. And
how do you keep them from being subverted?
Lots of different ways. This is a design problem, right? So I could start to rattle a whole bunch of things off. But the point is that I'm writing about that kind of thing. So I've written stories about that and will continue to write stories about that. I have a story, Eminence, which came out in David Brin's Chasing the Shadows anthology, which directly addresses, some of these problems of authenticity, proof of identity, and so on and so forth. This is an ongoing project for me, and it's one that's going to ramp up over time, hopefully to the novel level and novels level. But yeah, there's all kinds of ways to criticize, potential institutional design. But the point is, you can do it, and you can find ways to mitigate problems that we were unable to mitigate in the past. There's a lot of trustless technologies and things that we have now that we didn't have before, that have a lot of potential for helping us do that. Of course, at the same time, there's a set of complementary technologies that are being used to try and enslave us all. So it's a kind of an arms race, right? But it's an interesting arms race to write about.
Yeah, no, I've never done better. So yeah, from our own parochial perspectives, yeah, this is a great gig. But I would argue that, again, getting back to human nature, we suffer from optimism bias, and I do, and I'm pretty sure you do. I read a story of yours. Speaking of your fiction, I don't think it was Stealing Worlds, but it was in the Stealing Worlds universe. Because Stealing Worlds came out in what, 2019?
Yeah.
And this
Before
was
that, a lot of it's based on a novella called Tahai from Far Silenia, which came out as an audiobook originally. But
no, this was
Degrees
this
of
was
Freedom.
post-pandemic. This story was post-pandemic
Oh,
because
okay.
it referred to the pandemic, right? And if it wasn't you that had written it, I would have thought, oh, here's a serious failure of imagination. But knowing your stuff as I do, lack of imagination is not your problem. But you wrote this in the wake of COVID, or perhaps in the depths of COVID. And the story itself, and maybe you can tell me what it is, because for all I know, maybe you didn't even write it. Maybe it was somebody else. I'm pretty sure it was you. Kept referring to, it was one of those, ecosystems have rights, rivers have rights.
Oh yeah.
It was an exploration of that riff. And the characters kept talking about the pandemic and how the government had bought itself out of the pandemic. And I kept thinking, dude, why do you think there's only one? If there have been emerging infectious diseases and outbreaks have quadrupled since 1970. That rate of increase is only ramping up. We have only identified 1% of the bugs that can do us in, according to the best estimates, much less developed any countermeasures to them. And you, who develop these absolutely gorgeous lyrical dreamscapes of zero-G ecosystems and spaceships made out of wood and all that shit that you've done some absolutely brilliant stuff that is mind-bogglingly imaginative. Plus, you work as a futurist. And even so, this moderate to near future proscriptive piece of fiction took a single pandemic, basically a candy-ass sniffle fest with a measly 1% to 2% mortality rate, and referred to it as this big event, as opposed to, merely one in a number of minor opening acts that are going to catastrophically cascade over the next number of years, to the point where, according to the best estimates, the human population is going to crash by half by the end of the century. And that's not even taking into account things like, flooding and firestorms and social unrest. This is just due to diseases. And I would argue that the reason for that is because you, like all the rest of us, suffer from optimism bias. And that's something else that bites us in the ass. It's not just that we don't think the future is real, it's that we tend to overestimate the effectiveness of the solutions that we have. And I don't know how to fix that. I am at a loss. I don't know how to fix that short of rewiring those parts of the brain that are involved in these kind of cognitive biases. And the problem with that is that those cognitive biases developed as survival, developed as survival measures. There's like hundreds of these things, and they all help us to survive by lying to us about the way reality is. So we seem to be faced with a choice between either seeing the world as it really is, or caring whether we live or die.
Yeah, and this is an issue that I've always had with you, Peter, is that you seem to think that it's the better solution is to see the world as it really is. That's ridiculous. No, no.
Okay.
The better solution is the better solution is to follow those biases when they help you to survive. But first of all, with regard to that story, by calling it the pandemic, I retained that idea at a sufficiently low level of amplitude or volume in the story that I could continue to write or keep the reader's mind on what I wanted them to be focused on in the story. So there's a deliberate choice there. But secondly, optimism doesn't have to be a bias. Again, it can be a deliberate choice. Now, I have a family. Therefore, for me, optimism is not optional. It can't be. It is a moral imperative. And therefore, what I work very hard at is what I call earned optimism. In other words, not being just a Pollyanna and saying, oh, it'll be fine, like that internet meme cartoon of the dog sitting in the burning room, right? No.
Right.
There is a very common bias, a strong bias against optimism by people who believe that it is sophisticated to be pessimistic. But it's no more sophisticated, at the very least, to be pessimistic than it is to be optimistic. More to the point, again, it's morally required that we have earned optimism. That is to say, that we decide to design the future that is going to work with a very clear-eyed notion of what the obstacles are and what the dangers are. And just push through them. That is what I'm interested in doing. And I'm not interested in defeatism. I'm not interested in spinning my wheels with recriminations. I'm not interested, again, in politicizing issues that are not political when there are other ways to approach them. I have an obligation to find answers as a designer, as a writer whose work does get read by people whose actions could be influenced by it. And I take that very seriously. I take it seriously in the sense that I'm not just going to sweep things under the carpet. It's very important to see what the issues are, to not shy away from them, but to say, all right, what are we going to do about it? And when you come to me with something that is possible or impossible about the future, my first reaction is, well, how do we make it possible? because
Okay.
that's the scale on which we have to work now.
Okay. 90% of those words were fighting ones. So cool. But before I respond to those, I'm curious. You started off by saying that you essentially were an obligatory optimist because you had a family. So here's my question. Knowing what you know now, if you could jump back in time 30 years, would you have a family?
Absolutely.
So basically, you deliberately got yourself into a situation where you were forced to be optimistic despite the facts on the ground. Well, basically, what that comes down to and I don't want to harp on this because I want to answer the points you were making, but to me that comes down to the biggest cognitive bias of all, which is nothing is more important than my genes, nothing is more important than family. Sure, I cheated to
No,
get my kid to the head of the vaccination line, but I did it for family.
no. The
These
whole
are these
selfish,
are
the whole
these
selfish
are
gene thing just does not work with this, because you know, family is more than family. It's society. It's connection. It's
I didn't ask if you were going to be a hermit. I asked if you were actually going to reproduce.
but
And you said yes.
reproduction again. You could have asked me whether I would continue to be a writer, and I would have said yes as well, because that's the same thing.
Writing doesn't
It's
have nearly the carbon imprint that having a first world child does, though.
but it's all moving into the future as opposed to spinning one's wheels or running away.
And that's what you think the pessimists are doing.
Yes.
Okay. I am reminded of Guillermo del Toro on the cover of Time magazine saying that hope was the radical option. And in fact, hope is not the radical option, hope is the default option. I think you're drawing a false dichotomy between optimism and pessimism as though there is a middle ground and it is as pernicious to veer into one side of the road as it is the other. I don't think that recognizes the fact that we are wired to be delusionally optimistic. And there's one vital exception to that, which is why I write the kind of things that I do.
Why did you put the word delusionally in there?
Because it's not reflective of reality.
We
The,
wouldn't be
the,
here if
the
we had,
people,
if the optimism of the past had not been born
that
out.
is an excellent point. The fact that something, and again, that gets us back to cognitive biases, they help you survive by lying to you. And you're 100% right. There's a great line that somebody on the internet said, everybody thinks they're going to be Mad Max when civilization falls. Nobody thinks they're going to be one of the skulls piled up in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very true. Everybody does think that, but most people end up as skulls in the background. But if you believe that you're going to be Mad Max, if you have that optimism bias, you tend to do better on university exams for some reason.
So it's not a bias.
It is.
But
You still
you
end up
also
as
tend to
you still end up
Sorry, you also tend to
you.
go
I
and try
mean,
to
I mean,
invent things that other people think are impossible. And I think that's Karl's point here, right? That it's not just optimism versus pessimism. It's a tool for trying to solve problems. And if you stay with just what you know today and what the facts are on the ground today, things look pretty bad, but they always have. And yet people keep inventing their ways out of it, right? And so
Yeah,
you need the
I would not.
optimism to
I
just
would not
decide to go and
say.
find solutions.
I would not say that optimism is a tool that you use to find those solutions, though. I would say optimism is the motivator. Optimism gives you the desire or the impetus to try and do something.
You
But
see,
then
that's
again,
where we
but then
differ.
again, then again, so does pessimism.
Yeah, you
In
see,
fact,
no,
pessimism does a better job of that. But hang on, like
no, I'm just going to say,
if you actually want,
no. For me, optimism is a tool. I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I'm a designer. And
those are not
optimism is
exclusive terms.
but optimism is a particular tool. So no, I don't see it as a motivator at all in this context.
Yeah, there may be a difference in there may be just a difference in our backgrounds, right? Like I tend to think of things in biological terms because that's where I come from. So when I look at optimism as an attitude, I basically think of it as as an outlook, as a a neurochemical reaction. I think you tend to look at things more at sort of a societal systems point of view.
Yeah.
And so maybe to some extent we're talking past each other on that.
That that would be the first time.
I would
But
argue, though, that biology being more basic than societal systems, because societal systems basically arise from biology, the more fundamental issue is still the more fundamental problem. There are, I mean, yeah, you're probably right. I mean, we all, I don't know if does anybody remember the Goths? I mean, there was
well,
certainly there's certainly a bunch of people who sort of hang around and say, "Oh, woe is me," and we might as well just kill ourselves.
I'll
And
tell
they
you
read Sylvia Plath and
I'll tell you a
sorry.
story that sort of explains where I'm coming from. It's a story that my dad told me. That a good friend of his, when the Korean War broke out, he gave up. He decided that the world was ending. That was it. There was no reason to go on. He quit his job. He just sat in his room and he waited for the end. And he was absolutely 100% wrong. And yet it destroyed him, right?
Hmm.
Thinking that he was taking the clear-eyed view of the world and everybody else was just being a Pollyanna and shrugging off inevitable doom. He was wrong.
Well, if it helps save my if it improves my credit all, I'd just like to point out that, in the last century, I was a marine biologist who worked with and on conservation biology. I did stuff. I was pessimistic. I don't think I was spinning my wheels. Um, I I did intervenor reports on hydroelectric development. I worked on endangered sea lion populations on the west coast. I don't know how much impact any of those things had, but I have never. I mean, I think we agree on this. I have never regarded a pessimistic outlook, or I would prefer to call it a realistic outlook. And I think that even, I mean, one of my favorite lines is the when you actually look at data versus predictions, the optimists are always wrong and the pessimists are always too optimistic. So I don't know if I want to say I'm being pessimistic as opposed to just more muted in my delusional optimism, but I've never regarded that as an excuse to stop fighting. And
No, and this is one of
I
the
worked on
things.
conservation issues before, and I find it actually a little disturbing that I'm having empirically more of an influence on policy as somebody who writes science fiction stories than I actually did as a working science working on conservation issues.
Yeah, but this is what I admire about your work and your general attitude, Peter, is that you are absolutely uncompromising and you scare the shit out of people, and that's great because they absolutely need to have the shit scared out of them about all the stuff that we're facing. And you demand intellectual rigor of your readers. And that's something that I think is sadly lacking in a lot of science fiction these days. Um, the yeah, I love your stuff. And I love the fact that it is as uncompromising as it is because I do think we need that. And in terms, for instance, of dystopia versus utopia, I don't think I've ever said that we don't need dystopias and we don't need alarm. I think we do. I just tend to think that we need both. But I think there is no one writing, certainly in science fiction today, who can draw the the lines and the issues as starkly as you do. And I think that's absolutely invaluable.
I thank you for that. That actually means a lot. And I would just like to say that it's not that, and I think you may be doing a disservice to us pessimists. Just speaking for myself, it's not that I don't think things can't be fixed. Even now, I mean, I think we're in for a rough ride. We may be able to pull out of the nosedive. We may not. Things are definitely getting worse before they get better, but they could get better. And I agree things can be fixed. What pisses me off, what makes me, I suppose, a misanthrope, is that I don't think we're going to. You're working at it. I'm working at it in my way. But we're a couple of nobodies. And the ship just keeps chugging towards the iceberg. And every now and then you get one of the people that do make the decisions saying, hey, look at this. Look at this measure we've taken. At this rate, we'll avoid the iceberg entirely in just another 5 kilometers. And not really mentioning the fact that the iceberg is 500 fucking meters away. And it's so it's not that I don't think these things can be done. It's that I despair because the quarterly report takes precedence. And you can't blame capitalism for it, and you can't blame religion for it, although both of those things are vile and pernicious entities, because both of those things are just formalized delivery platforms for our own short-sightedness. And again, that comes back to human nature. And yeah, we can visualize, my God, I mean, this is our job, right? Of course, we can intellectually imagine things happening 10, 20, 50, 1,000, 2,000 years. We can imagine things all the way to heat death. It's not that we don't have the capacity to imagine, but internalizing those projections with the same sense of gut-clenching dread that we internalize the sight of a charging grizzly bear coming out of the forest at us. That's what we need, and that's what we lack the capability to do. We are wired to respond to grizzly bears. We are not wired to respond to contingency tables and p-values of 0.0001. Those things mean nothing to us. And my fear is that, given the option to fix things, we just won't be bothered.
Yeah, and you're rightly furious about it, and I admire that anger. And I take all of this as a design challenge because, we do lack that capability. So the question in my mind is, how do we develop it? Right? Certainly not within ourselves, but again, society, institutions, we have all these inventions that we use to compensate for what we lack. We need a new generation of them. And my question is, what does that new generation of institutions and social norms and so forth look like?
Why institutions? Institutions can be hacked by short-sighted sociopaths who don't want to lose any money. Why not go down to the root? Why not go to biology? Why not change our biology?
Well, if you want to talk about the law of unintended consequences and things that can't be backed out of.
A very wise man once said, oh, a lot of people when presented with the sunscreen model say, oh, no, we don't want to do that. There could be unintended consequences.
Well,
and
exactly.
you rightly dismissed that in the same way that I would dismiss if you are in a plane that's supposed to be flying at 30,000 feet and it's now at like 10,000 and in a complete nosedive. The question is not, is this a perfect solution that is not going to hurt anybody? The question isn't even, is this a good solution? Because it's probably a bad one. You're right. The question is it as bad as the trajectory we are already on?
And we fundamentally agree, although about separate solutions.
Well, it seems to me you guys are a great combination. Peter, you've got the stick, and Karl, you've got the carrot. and you need both a stick and a carrot, right, to
You make
change
it sound
people's
like a
trajectories or
BDSM
move them.
couple.
And I'm running away holding the carrot while he's running after me with the stick. Yeah. But it works. Yeah. Well, this is a normal, coffee conversation.
It would be if we ever got together for coffee. So I recall
Yeah.
last time you and I hang out, you had a scotch. No, it wasn't a scotch. You had some kind of hard liquor because you can't drink malt beverages for some reason, as I recall.
No. It's alcohol. It doesn't play with the various chemicals that my doctor tells me keep me alive.
I
But,
thought you had this one. I thought there was this one kind of hard liquor or something that you could have.
Oh, it doesn't mean I don't fall off the wagon whenever I get the chance. But,
Have you been?
yeah,
have
but
you
it's
been
been a
to-
while.
Have you been to Off-World yet?
No, I hear it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, we do have to get together and have this conversation in private for a change.
Well, that was great. We covered one of the five
Yeah,
topics.
then we can say what
the
we
end of the
really
world
think.
topic is. It's a big one, though. It's great. Yeah,
It's a perennial favorite. What can I say? Yeah.
yeah. Well, it strikes me, listening to you, that the thing about projections, right, is you can't fundamentally include future inventions in projections. Or you can, and it seems silly, right? It just seems like, oh, yeah, we'll figure something out. That's just pie in the sky, nothing. But the fact is, everybody that's ever made projections in the past has been wrong, not just because they've been too optimistic or too pessimistic,
everybody.
but because something came along that they just couldn't imagine at the time, and it changed everything, right? We used to, light lamps with whale oil, and oh no, the whales are going to go extinct, right? And then we invented something completely different, didn't need to kill the whales anymore. Fusion, right?
Whales still aren't doing great.
Well, they are coming back, I hear, at least, aren't they? Some of them?
The Japanese Norwegians, I believe, have rebooted up their
Oh, they have.
certainly their minke whales. Yeah. I mean, we haven't used whale oil since the early part of the 20th century, and whales were being hammered into extinction in the 60s and 70s still.
Don't let
gotta
him
remember,
derail
I
you
did-
from your point, Marty.
Sorry,
you
yeah,
were going
no,
somewhere with that.
I know. I apologize. My background's in marine mammals, so I'm a total pedant about that. We can cut this out in post, right?
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, but there are things that people are working on, right? There are things that people could create and achieve, right? That will change our trajectory in surprising ways and surprisingly fast. And Karl's been talking about green energy getting so much cheaper, and I totally agree with you, Peter, right? That we can't rely on people to just, unless we hack their biology or something, right? We can't rely on people's goodwill and sudden ability to think much longer term. No, we're bad at that. What we should be doing is playing to our strengths and just finding solutions that are the short term sort of things, and that's economics, right? Make it cheaper than oil. And then people won't use oil anymore, and they won't won't emit CO2, right? And that seems to have happened. But what hasn't happened yet is the rest of the infrastructure hasn't caught up to stop using oil, right? But once and there are enough electric cars that can take electricity from a grid that's fed by green things, well, then, oil really can collapse and we can stop burning it. It's just there's a lot of ingredients, right? There's a lot of different pieces that have to come together for major changes to happen. And they've happened in the past, and one would hope they'll happen in the future, and one would hope even more that they'll happen in time. And I take your point, Peter. They simply might not, right?
That is there is a brick wall that we are headed for, and everything you say, everything Karl says, if we went back 20, 30 years and started replaying the tape with what we know now, we could do it. We could wean. But there are I believe there are certain fundamental physical limits. And unless the Pillsbury Doughboy climbs out of the flying chandelier at the end of Close Encounters and says, hey, we're going to save your ass, we've got this new magical technology, given the trajectories our current technology is on, we're at the point where, yes, the Titanic can avoid the iceberg, and at our current rate of implementation, it will be able to avoid the iceberg about 3 kilometers past the point at which it collides with the iceberg. And
right.
So I'm not saying that that there aren't technological solutions. I'm saying that we've left it so fucking long. And I mean, something that utterly appalls me is Weird Al Yankovic. And this is legitimate. This actually is relevant. Weird Al Yankovic in the 1970s, at his valedictorian address at his high school, ranted about climate change. This was before the World Wide Web. The internet was still basically an academic, a purely academic thing. This is a nerdy kid in high school playing an accordion who has no privileged access, no online sources of news. And this kid saw the writing on the wall in the 1970s. In 1982, 83, the US government was actually ready to implement a phase out of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry was on board with this. And then Reagan got in. And all that shit went to, and if you're looking at the various legal proceedings that are being launched against ExxonMobil and so on at this point, because of their obvious denialism and the suppression of their own research. It was that research in the early 80s that led them to think, yeah, we better do this. But then Carter lost and Reagan won, and it was like, okay, back to business as usual. So we knew this stuff was going on. Weird Al Yankovic knew this stuff was going on in plenty of time to fix it. And here we are, half a century later, and I go on to do my morning hate read of Quora, and you've still got people saying climate change is a hoax. I would say that pessimism in this case is not just being fashionably nihilistic. I would say that pessimism is a perspective that reality has dragged us kicking and screaming towards, despite our best efforts to avoid it.
Oh, sure. Be a pessimist all you want, but do something.
You know what? I don't do. I'm doing more than you in that I got a vasectomy in 1991. I can now fly back and forth. I can now fly back and forth across the Atlantic every week of the year and still have less of a carbon impact than you had by having one child.
By you, I don't mean you in particular, Peter. But I don't care if the entire human race is in a state of absolute despair and nihilism, as long as they do something, right? The attitude I don't care about. The spiritual wasteland of the real, I don't care. What I care about is boots on the ground, about what gets done, because again, coming back around to it, in this particular case, it's a thermodynamic and a chemical problem. Everything else, spiritual, political, that's just stuff that we sort out on the way to fixing those sides of it.
I have to profoundly disagree with you. I know what you're saying, I think. But if it was purely a question of physics, we would have solved it.
We know how to solve it from a physics point of view.
The only reason it became a problem is because social systems suppressed the actual physics.
Sure, the social
we knew
systems,
this stuff was going on.
That makes the politics the problem, not the physics. I don't regard climate change as a geophysical problem. I regard it as a political one. And a lot of people share that view, and it's correct as far as it goes. But the point is that if that is where a complete deadlock exists, then we have to look elsewhere for the solutions.
I don't think a deadlock. I mean, maybe you could explain to me where that deadlock comes from. To me,
COP27,
it's something we can argue about, but it should. Sorry,
COP27, COP26, COP25. Paris Accords, the Kyoto Accords, all these points at which actual action has been stymied.
But it's been stymied because of political
Yes,
action, not because of the underlying biophysics is the thing that's getting ignored.
right.
I
But I think
must be
Carl's suggesting.
misunderstanding what you say when you.
Well, if I may, I think Carl, you might be suggesting you can
Yeah, no,
short
I can
circuit or
totally
go around that problem, right, by making green energy cheaper, right? If the politics isn't going to get it done because it's too expensive
Again, we don't.
well, then make a technology that's cheaper, and that'll just short circuit that problem, go around it. Create fusion power. If we have
Yeah.
green
If there's time,
power, we can
if
suck all
there's
the
time for
CO2 we want out.
implementation, sure.
But the thing there isn't time for is a political reconciliation. The thing there is no time for is for this to be solved on the political level, because what we have seen so clearly is that that is taking way too long. It's advancing one funeral at a time. And as you so rightly pointed out with the analogy about the Titanic, we don't have the time. So so it is not that we should not be working on the political level. It's just that politics is one of the arrows in our quiver, and we should not be neglecting the other ones.
I think we are. I think we are converging on something, and a particularly, I don't know, odious consequence of that something we're converging on. I mean, we're basically looking. I think we agree. We totally agree. The politics isn't doing it fast enough. I think that your solution of just coming up with better technology would have worked fast enough, but we don't have time for that now. And that leaves us one of two things. That leaves us with either terrorism or Elon Musk, except with a little more foresight. We're either talking about somebody who, I mean, the moment you say we have to get around the politics, you're basically talking something extra legal. So that means you're either talking about something that's going to be described as terrorism by legal systems, or you're talking about one individual with so much economic power that he doesn't need government approval. He can he can be your Heinlein Superman and simply build his own space program or build his own carbon sequestration program. Is there a third option?
Look, I wrote a whole book based on the premise that technology is legislation. Bringing in a new technology is the equivalent of legislating a change in society. The problem is that it's a roulette wheel. We don't know what that change is going to be ahead of time because we don't think in those terms, right? We bring in cell phones without thinking in advance about what societal impact they're going to have. But they have a societal impact. Social media is the obvious example recently. Technology is not societally or politically neutral. It is, in fact, a way of engaging in politics. But it also is not something that it has to be led by the great man theory of history. Elon Musk didn't invent any of the technologies that he's pushing forward. What he did was push on a couple of inflection points. And that could have been done by governments, that could have been done by large, faceless corporations. There's a lot of different institutional actors that could have done the things that he's doing. So in a situation like this, pursuing technological means is societal engagement. But it's also not necessarily something that an individual, some Heinlein hero, or an Ayn Rand, John Galt type has to be there to push.
Well, if that's not what's going to happen, here's a question: would you rather live in Canada, or would you rather live in an essentially an authoritarian state like China, assuming that China is as good as its word and actually is pivoting on a dime without that messy democracy stuff to get in the way? Going back to your question about supposing somebody has an ironclad solution, if you want to get around political deadlocks, essentially eliminating democracy and imposing a top-down dictatorship is a really good way of responding quickly, assuming you can do it before everybody revolts. How would you feel about sacrificing all personal freedoms for that kind of a payoff?
It's an awful solution, and there are conceivable situations in which it might be the only solution. But I'm a big believer in Ashby's law of requisite variety, that the governing system has to have as much internal complexity and variety as the system it's governing. And an autocracy or an authoritarian state can never do that, because it's always a simplified, pared down, streamlined, single vision entity that is trying to govern a multi-sided, complicated, complex system. And
what about a chess analogy then? You simplify it's a complicated Gordian knot of a problem. You exchange, you do pawn sacrifices, you simplify the board game. You get away with the fact that you don't have to appeal to the Bible Belt anymore. You don't have to appeal to the latte sipping. I mean, it might be a way of an authoritarian system to also respect the law of requisite variety, because they manage to simplify the system that they're dealing with.
That is, in fact, the exact flip side of the law of requisite variety. There's two ways you can go. Either you increase your internal variety and complexity to match that of the system that you're governing, or you simplify the system that you're governing to match your own simplicity. In practice, what that usually means is pogroms, right?
Yeah.
It usually means genocide. It usually means forcing people across your borders. It means persecuting people who are different, making them as normal as possible.
Supposing you could save the world by doing that. Faustian bargain, would you go for it? You said you believe more in life in general than in the self-exaltation of humanity. Supposing we could restore the global biosphere to a relatively stable and healthy state, but at the cost of all these things you described, the pogroms, the repression, the lack of human rights. Would you consider that a good trade?
I wouldn't consider it a good trade, no. But this is one of those cases where we have to start arguing from the perspective of species that are not human. Mm-hmm. And rather than looking at what's good for mankind, what's good for Earth. This is a fairly popular trope in climate fiction, is climate, eco-terrorism. And I don't believe that would be effective at all. I think it's just adding to the problems. But it's...
logistically, I mean, it wouldn't work. I mean, states use terrorism all the time.
Yeah,
police forces and military just come in and beat the shit out of people, right? So it's not that terrorism doesn't work. It's just that eco-terrorism is weak and feeble, and when it goes up against the state. So are you arguing because the logistics don't work, or because you have an ethical objection to terrorism in principle?
Probably both. Remember, I was raised as a Mennonite, so for me, it's profoundly difficult to contemplate any solution that involves violence or repression.
I was raised as a Baptist. It's profoundly difficult for me to entertain any solution that doesn't involve those things.
Yeah. So, all I can say is that as a writer, I would definitely put these forces in play in a book. And in fact, I intend to, because I want to do a near future, climate punk novel. And yeah, these are big, difficult issues. But I also don't think that it's the kind of dilemma that we're going to face. We're going to face all kinds of micro complex versions of all of these things back and forth. But once again, Earth is not a system that can be simplified.
We're simplifying it to the tune of 70 to 130,000 species every year.
Yes, and we both know where that's going to get us.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
yeah. So really, the first mode of Ashby's law is where I come down to. We do have to increase our own requisite variety, our internal variety. We have to be up to the complexity, equal to the complexity of the issues that have been presented to us. And the only way to do that is within a free society, where that all the complexity of human nature is actually allowed free play. But that I go further than that, and I propose that natural systems, be allowed to be political actors and economic actors within our system for precisely the same sort of reasons. That by excluding them and considering them to be standing reserve resource to be used, we cripple our ability to actually work with the natural systems that we are ostensibly trying to save.
I think in principle, that's an absolutely wonderful premise. I'd love to see that work. What I'd love even more is to see you write a story in which Russian hackers get into the riverine ecosystem software that allows it to speak on its own behalf, so that all of a sudden various ecosystems around the world are advocating in favor of the invasion of Ukraine or their own exploitation. The suicide of something, the suicide of all our troubles.
Oh, suicide of our troubles. Yeah.
The suicide of our troubles. Yeah. So I can just see you going in. I can see somebody going in there, hacking the software so that it basically advocates for the suicide of an ecosystem, so that somebody can put condos up there.
Yeah, the reason I don't write that story is because somebody is going to. It's the obvious story to write when you've got those ideas, right? So I know that somebody's going to do it.
Well, that'll be our next step in this journey, with having you guys have conversations. Now you're going to have to write stories back and forth at each other from your own perspective. And if you want, you guys should go first to Offworld, but then the second time you should invite us, and we'll come into town. We'll all go. That'd be amazing.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. Until next time.
Well, that was a lot of fun as usual. Karl and Peter are a lot of fun. We enjoy them very much. We'll see them again sometime in the future. Next week, Cory Doctorow and Shauna McGuire are competing in Trivia from the Bridge. Join us for that one. We'll have a bunch of those episodes coming out every once in a while. All right. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time.